Good. Good. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Regina. I direct the travel program, and I'm responsible for getting this little meeting together so that you have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the Galapagos trip that unfortunately was canceled this year. Now, I know we have some people on the call that haven't actually signed up for the tour, but have expressed interest in a tour in the past. So I thought it would be nice to invite them to come to see our faculty professors and also our representative from the tour operator, Orbridge. Looks like we had Tim join us as well. I'm going to just start it off right away. We're going to have Vanessa speak first, then Michael, and then Pam, and then we'll have time for questions and answers later. Okay, Vanessa Cheatham is the Senior Director of Sales at Orbridge and has been with the company for the last 8.5 years. She came to Orbridge from Alumni Relations at Carnegie Mellon University in Pennsylvania. Excuse me. Her favorite Orbridge destinations are the Galapagos Islands and East Africa. She's a graduate of Penn State University, but don't hold that against her, and Carnegie Mellon University. She has 2 daughters that keep her busy, and they love hiking, cooking, and traveling together. So welcome, Vanessa.
Thanks so much. It's really nice to see all of your faces. I wish I was with you in person, but I appreciate you, Regina, setting this up. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I just have a really kind of quick rundown about the Galapagos, which happens to be my favorite Orbridge destination. So sorry, let me just move that around a tiny bit. There we go. Okay, great. The Galapagos are really unlike any other place that I've been in the world. They were designated as the first UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978. And they've been described as a unique living museum and a showcase of evolution. On this tour, one of my favorite parts is that it's a blend of wildlife, its fascinating own ecosystem, culture, and history. There's really, I think, something that can interest everyone. On this program, we'll first fly into Quito, Ecuador, and we'll depart from Guayaquil, Ecuador. During the middle of our journey, we travel to and through 5 of the islands in the Galapagos Islands chain. So a little about Ecuador, where we'll first arrive into. The Republic of Ecuador was named after There we go. Okay, that's okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. The Republic of Ecuador is situated right on the equator, and it happens to have been named after the equator. You can see on the map that it's located in the western corner at the top of the South American continent, and it's roughly the size of Colorado. It's bordered by Colombia and Peru, which happens to be where our post tour is headed, to Machu Picchu, just in case anyone is headed on that trip. As I mentioned, we fly into Quito, and that's where we begin our trip together. Ecuador was part of the Inca Empire until the Spanish arrived, and for about 300 years, the Spanish controlled Ecuador until the country became independent from Spain in 1822. And actually, about 10% of the population in Ecuador is of European descent, and about another 25% is from indigenous or native cultures. Quito is the capital of Ecuador, and our day begins with a full guided journey in historic Old Town Quito. A local guide will take you through the Quito neighborhood of San Roque, where you'll visit locals and explore life alongside them. Some of the locals that you'll get to experience life with are artisans, shopkeepers, hat makers, doll makers, chefs, and others. We also explore the famous San Francisco market, which is truly a feast for the senses. You'll learn and taste Ecuadorian vegetables and fruits, and you also learn some local culinary traditions. Then you continue on your journey to this lovely little neighborhood, La Ronda, which is in the top right corner of the slide. You see all those balconies decorated with flags. It's really a charming place. And in that neighborhood, we wind our way to an award-winning chocolate shop. We learned from that family of locals how cacao beans are processed, and we taste what I think was some of the finest chocolate I've ever eaten in my life. So it's definitely a treat. You can't be in Quito and miss the exquisite Jesuit church of La Compañía. So we'll visit that in the afternoon. And then we head to an archaeological museum, which is actually in a restored 17th century colonial mansion. And we will get a curator-led tour of pre-Columbian art. In the evening of our first full day in Quito, you'll get to know your fellow Spartans at a reception and prepare for the next day's adventures to the islands. I should mention, I'm glad this slide reminded me, you stay at an exquisite property in Old Town Quito. It's right on the Plaza San Francisco in the heart of the Spanish colonial Old Town. You can see the square, the plaza, up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. And the property is called Casa Gangatena. It is really lovely. It's a respite from the busyness of Quito. And during your time at Casa, you can enjoy tea on the patio, which is in the lower right-hand corner. The rooms are absolutely lovely. You can see a photo of them. The bar was just restored. You can see that as well. It's really quite lovely. And you look out your windows and you see the governor's palace right across the square. It's a great place to spend your time in Quito. The next morning, we take our flight to the islands. And the islands have created a little fun fact about them. You may already know this, but I'll indulge me for a second. The islands have created something like Africa's Big Five whenever you go on safari there. They have the big mammals that everyone wants to see, lion and rhino and so on. So the Galapagos have created something called the Big 15. And so throughout the journey, your guides, who are exceptional naturalists and actually native to the islands, they're going to be pointing out many species, but they're definitely experts on the Big 15, and they're going to be pointing them out and highlighting them for you. So as I mentioned, we'll visit 5 of the islands, and I'll just give you a quick rundown of what we're going to do each day. The first island that we visit on our adventure together is Santa Cruz. So once we arrive by plane into Baltra Airport, we'll transfer by ferry across to Santa Cruz. After a short drive through the island, we arrive in the highlands and we enjoy lunch at a local family-owned restaurant. This restaurant is, it's really hidden from view. You cannot see it from the road. It's nestled in just nature surrounds it. It's beautiful. And the family's lovely. They sit down with you and they get to know you and they share their own personal experience. And they are local farmers as well. After lunch, you experience the iconic species for which the Galapagos was named. And my pictures give the answer away. If you guessed that it was the Galapagos tortoise, you're right. You get to see the tortoise up close and walk among them. You'll learn about the various stages of tortoise care. You'll learn about their development at a baby tortoise house. And you'll also learn about conservation efforts with the animals. You'll head to Charles Darwin Research Station, which is also on Santa Cruz, to learn more about conservation efforts all around the islands and with all of the species. Late that afternoon, we embark the yacht Isabella II. Every day that you're in the islands, you're going to have a variety of options for what to do during your time there. And you'll get to experience the islands in many different ways, like hiking. And you can see some of our guests there, snorkeling, kayaking, going on panga rides every day, going on glass bottom boat rides, to really immerse yourself in all the islands have to offer in whatever way you really are comfortable. So you choose. If you love hiking, there's an abundance of opportunity. If you love snorkeling, we can arrange for that too. And it's often available on most of the islands. So day 4, we're on Santiago Island, which is the site of a former salt mine. And it's the most likely place that you'll see the Galapagos fur seal, which is tricky. They look like sea lions, but they actually have a shorter snout and kind of thicker fur. Your naturalists are going to point them out to you, or your amazing Michigan State professors. Santiago also has several satellite islands, one of which is the Chini Hat Islet. And formerly, it was formed only fairly recently, a really lovely wildlife trail. You just saw it. And it begins at a beautiful beach. And the cove right there off of the beach is an ideal place for swimming and snorkeling, and also spotting the Galapagos penguin, which is one of those big 15 that I had mentioned. Being that this is the world's second largest marine reserve, you'll see a myriad of aquatic wildlife. There have been times whenever I've been there that my panga has been surrounded by schools of fish or tortoise or dolphin, or whenever I'm snorkeling, I've been face to face with tortoise in the water. It's absolutely thrilling. And those are some of our guests over here on the panga. On day 5, you visit Genovesa. After breakfast, you depart on a panga ride to the cliffs of Genovesa, and this is also known as Bird Island. So on this island, you're definitely, you can guess it, likely to spot a lot of those big 15, which are birds. There is a short hike on this island that allows you to get extremely close to the red-footed and blue-footed boobies, to the Nazca colonies, perhaps even the short-eared owl, which I understand is quite elusive. So those not wanting to hike, again, can opt for a longer panga ride along the cliffs, where you also do some spotting. And then following lunch, you head to Darwin Bay on the other side of the island, where that photo of the baby seal at the bottom was captured. And you'll be able to stroll along that beach, taking your time to just enjoy the wildlife, and in particular the birds. Then we head to Santa Fe, which is populated by colonies of sea lions. I'm sorry, this is day 6. And in that particular island, the Galapagos hawks are often observed in the bushes. Santa Fe is also known for the Santa Fe land iguana, which is another one of the big 15. Let's see, day 7 is whenever we depart for Baltra and we disembark the Isabella II and prepare for our flight to Guayaquil. Before I end, I'd like to tell you a little about the amazing ship that you'll be calling your home for 5 days. It's a deluxe yacht. It's limited to 40 people. It's really a comfortable way to see the islands. You know, it allows you the flexibility of a small ship sailing into coves and docking in areas that are pretty exclusive to small ships. So really unprecedented wildlife viewing. All of the meals are made on board from fresh local ingredients. It's Ecuadorian cuisine, and the chefs are absolutely terrific. There are 21 staterooms, all fully air conditioned, and very comfortable ensuite facilities there. You can see in the photo there's a beautiful lounge where we find everyone gathering in the evenings to listen to lectures and share a drink together, look at photos together. There's an open air deck and dining area, as you can see in the bottom right. And the crew really is another highlight of this trip. As I mentioned, you'll have 3 expert naturalists with you, native to the islands, and they'll lead you through your itinerary and really give lectures and offer insight on the program. And the crew is also exceptional and all Ecuadorian. So they're very proud of their country and proud of the islands, and they just convey that in everything they do. So a great high level of service. And you can see those are the dates that we have planned to travel with the Spartans. And I'll be around. I'll stick around until the end to answer any questions that you have after the professors speak. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Very nice. I have to say, I actually have traveled with Orbridge on the Isabella II, and it is a fantastic, oh, I forgot to turn my video back on. I apologize. Okay, so yes, I have traveled on the Isabella II, and like she said, the naturalists are fantastic. They're wonderful, and the ship's very comfortable, and the food was excellent. So I can confirm that as well. Okay, I'm going to move on. We're going to have Michael Gottfried speak next. Michael is an associate professor in earth and environmental sciences at Michigan State University and curator of paleontology at MSU Museum. Mike's paleontology field research has included leading expeditions to Africa, Madagascar, New Zealand, and the Canadian Arctic, and a new project on the Falkland Islands. He currently teaches glacial geology and climate change in paleontology at MSU, and has led several MSU study abroad programs to Antarctica and Iceland. Welcome, Michael. Oh, you're still muted, Michael.
Rookie mistake. How's that? Okay. Sorry about that. You'd think I would know better after lecturing since March online, but anyway, thank you, Regina, and thank you, Vanessa, for that nice overview of the program. It's great to see a few familiar faces, Steve and Adrian and Warren out in the audience, and really looking forward to hopefully having an exciting trip together next year. So what I'd like to talk about tonight, just to give you a little historical and scientific historical context for the Galapagos, is the obvious connections with Charles Darwin, particularly in Darwin's early in Darwin's life with his epic voyage of discovery on the HMS Beagle, which included, I think, really his most iconic and most famous stop, if you will, the time he spent on the Galapagos Islands. So this first picture is actually the Beagle passing through the area around Tierra del Fuego and glaciers in southern South America. Then it was going to pass through that, head up the west coast of South America toward the Galapagos near the equator. But the Beagle was very much a sailing ship. The voyage took place in the 1830s, as we'll talk about. So Charles Darwin, just a little biography. I promise this is not a history lesson per se, but just to, again, to put it into a little historical perspective. Charles Darwin actually shares a birthday the exact same day with Abraham Lincoln, February 12th, 1809. This is Darwin in middle age, about the time he wrote his most famous work, The Origin of Species. This is Darwin as an elderly man. I think in some ways the image that is most pervasive in terms of the public conception of Darwin, if you will, with the large forehead and the flowing white beard and the wrinkled, furrowed brow, thinking deep, deep thoughts. And Darwin clearly is one of the great figures in scientific history. And again, I think this is an image that has come down through the ages in popular culture of our conception of Darwin. But what I'm really interested in tonight, and in connection with the Galapagos directly, is Darwin as a young man. This is Charles Darwin. It's actually the painting that was done at the time of his wedding. This was actually after he returned from the Beagle voyage, but it's the best image really we have of him as a relatively young man. He's 31 here. This was painted in 1840, a few years after they got back, and you get a much different image of Darwin than in that classic iconic flowing white beard picture that I just showed you. And in fact, Darwin, as an even younger person, as a boy growing up, was a bit of I don't want to say wild child, might be a little bit strong, but he liked being outside. He liked doing outdoor activities. He wasn't particularly scholarly as a boy and as a young college student. This is a quote from his father, said to him while he was still a boy, "You care for nothing but shooting dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." He would do things like chemistry experiments in the basement of the house that ended up blowing up or filling the house with some noxious fumes. And this is a cartoon of Darwin riding on the back of a giant beetle with a butterfly collecting net. So again, the image you get of him is really interested in nature and the outdoors, not particularly focused on more formal sorts of education. He is, of course, the author of The Origin of Species and actually a large stack of other books and scientific papers. So again, most famous for developing the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is really the foundation that all of modern biology rests on. Darwin was actually a relatively wealthy. He was born into a fairly prominent and wealthy British family. As I mentioned, he early in his life, particularly, was not a particularly focused student. He went to Edinburgh first to study medicine, didn't like that. He went to Cambridge and studied briefly to become a member of the clergy in the Church of England, somewhat ironically. That didn't work out either. But he did get exposed and interact with some of the famous naturalists of the day, particularly geologists and botanists. And he spent a lot of time on field excursions. So Darwin would go off through the British countryside collecting rocks and plants with the faculty at Cambridge in those areas. And that's where he really further cultivated his love of natural history. But he was still a bit aimless in terms of actually thinking about what he would do as a career. So as he got a little bit older, in his early 20s now, against his father's wishes, he joins the crew of the HMS Beagle late in 1831. And there was the intention that he would serve a role on that voyage as a naturalist, but just as much as being a naturalist, he was meant to be a gentleman companion from the same social class as the ship's captain, Robert Fitzroy. And the ship, as we'll see, was not set out on this epic voyage to provide Darwin with the opportunity to observe nature around the world. It was a British Royal Navy ship that was tasked with making maps and charting port areas in the expanding British Empire. So the Beagle set sail a couple of days after Christmas in 1831, did not return until October of 1836, about twice the length. The voyage ended up taking about twice the length that it was originally planned for. And again, this is in the age of sail. There aren't very many ways to get rescued if you get in trouble in the far-flung corners of the world during this time. So it was not a safe thing to do at all. Many of these ships set out and were not able to return. And importantly, in the history of science, the Beagle voyage, and I think many of you, I'm sure, are aware of this, the Beagle voyage provided Darwin with the opportunity to make observations that really went into and inspired and informed his evolutionary theory. And this is a quote from Darwin, which doesn't actually say much about his formal university education. "The voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career. I have always felt that I owe to the voyage the first real training or education of my mind." This is after time at the universities of Edinburgh and Cambridge. And here's a little inset drawing of the Beagle and a map showing the course around the world. The Beagle sets off from England through the Atlantic along the east coast of South America, with stops on islands along the way, around Cape Horn, up the west coast to the Galapagos, then across the Pacific, visiting New Zealand and Australia, and eventually across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, back to South America, and then back home to England about 5 years later. So again, the Beagle was a surveying vessel. Again, it was not Darwin's personal ship tasked with giving him an opportunity to look at bugs and rocks around the world. The role of the Beagle was to make charts of ports and coastlines for the Royal Navy. She was 90 feet long. So think about that. For 5 years, 90 feet is less than the length of a basketball court. Sail propelled, of course. There were no powered engines in the Beagle. a crew of about 74. She had 6 cannons, but she was by no means a warship. And the Beagle actually made 3 major, very epic voyages. Darwin's was the middle of those. And Darwin's cabin, if you look at the side view of the Beagle, Darwin's cabin was right in the stern, kind of in the upper corner of the stern of the ship. And this gives you a nice idea of what she looked like. This was a replica that was made some years ago for a film, The Voyage of the Beagle. And this is the captain, Robert Fitzroy, who again, Darwin was meant to be sort of his companion at meals and someone he could converse with from the same social class. So I won't go into all these stops just to give you a feeling for it because we want to get to the Galapagos. But think of a person in his early 20s, still in the first half of the 1800s. The world was still, in many respects, a mysterious, in many respects, frightening and unknown place. And Darwin, this impressionable, really not particularly well trained at this point in his life, young naturalist, was able to see rainforests in South America, volcanic islands, places in southern South America, richly festooned with fossils that figured in his thinking. He's witnessed an earthquake in the Andes going up the west coast of South America. Really just a remarkable range of experiences. And of course, in the way we look at this now, really in effect peaking or culminating in his time in the Galapagos Islands. So I'm obviously not going to go through this list. This is a chronology of the voyage. Again, they left just after Christmas in 1831 from Plymouth, made a whole series of stops going around the world. They did not visit North America. That's a question that sometimes comes up. In fact, Darwin never visited North America. He got as far as northern South America, but he never visited really Central or North America at all in his life. The Galapagos visit happened in September of 1835, and then onward from there, finally returning to Falmouth in the UK in October of 1836. So Darwin, among other things, was a keen collector. He would collect just about anything he could get his hands on during the voyage. Rock samples, this is from the Falklands. Here are a series of the famous finches from the Galapagos. Alcohol preserved marine life, a stick insect, mollusks. For a geologist like myself, this is sort of a holy shrine. It's Darwin's rock hammer that he had on the Beagle, his microscope. And what he would do as the Beagle proceeded around the world is he would make up packages of the things he had collected, and they would meet a ship going the other way, returning to England. So periodically through the voyage, he would pack things up, make a parcel and send it on a ship so that it would all be waiting for him when he returned. Most of the collections are now either at the Natural History Museum in London or at Cambridge University. In terms of North America, just really quickly, there is one animal collected by Darwin in a North American collection. It's a long-legged shorebird called a Hudsonian godwit. It's in the collections of the Smithsonian. And you can see Darwin's name scrawled across the tag here if you look closely. And there's a single plant specimen, a fern from Chile, in the collections of the Missouri Botanical Garden. But Darwin, again, did not have a strong connection in his life with North America, although he had a very active correspondence with North American scholars, which will come into play right at the end of this. So, of course, his most famous, most iconic stop is at the Galapagos, these volcanic islands that we look forward to experiencing next year off the coast of Ecuador. Vanessa did a very nice job in introducing you to the sorts of things you can expect to see there. They are relatively arid volcanic islands, geologically quite young, formed within about the last 3 to 5 million years on one of the tectonic plates called the Nazca Plate that lies along the western side of South America. A similar picture to what you saw from Vanessa. Obviously, the scientific station on Santa Cruz Island in the Galapagos is named for Charles Darwin, and that appears to be on the itinerary, so I would be very excited to see that. A really major thing to see, again, reflecting Darwin's importance in the history of science. So what did he actually see there? Pam is going to talk a bit about the birds in terms of bird diversity and some of the interesting species. But I have to touch on birds a bit without trying to steal too much of her thunder, because in general, including the birds, Darwin was really struck by the animals and plants that he observed on the islands. As he went from island to island, he could see a pattern where the species were closely related, but different. And on each of the islands, they seemed to have their own set of specialized adaptations for very specific lifestyles suited for the environment and the conditions on that particular island. I think really one of the most famous examples involves the finches. So early on in the history of the Galapagos, finches reached those islands from South America. But many of the typical groups of birds that you find in South America never made it across onto the islands. So what in effect has happened is that the finches have taken on the ecological roles, the roles in the environment that you would expect other kinds of birds to actually occupy if you were on the South American mainland. So there's, for example, a woodpecker finch. Now, finches, regular finches, if you will, are not usually behaving like woodpeckers, but because there are no true woodpeckers on the Galapagos, there's a finch that has evolved to fit that role. And I should note also, this was not something that occurred fully formed in Darwin's head while he was on the islands. He took notes and collected specimens and made observations, but the real underlying significance of this pattern is something that didn't become absolutely clear in his mind until after he returned to England and started writing up his notes and his account of the voyage. So again, the finches on the Galapagos have ecological counterparts on the South American mainland that are not finches. So they've adapted, again, the finches that reach there have radiated and adapted to feeding on a wider range of food in the absence of other groups of birds that would typically fill those kinds of roles. So they've exploited open niches or open ecological opportunities on the Galapagos. And here's one of the famous ones. This is the woodpecker finch, which is actually a tool maker. You can see it. It uses a thin, sharp stick or a cactus spine and probes around in openings inside trees and shrubs to spear grubs and insects. And this is kind of caught in the act. You see this clever woodpecker finch with this, looks like maybe a cactus spine, just about to spear whatever this tasty little morsel is out of the branch. So hopefully we might be able to see something like that. But again, a finch on the South American mainland would not be going around with cactus spines spearing grubs out of tree branches. Here are some other, even more specialized finches that if we're very, very fortunate, and look closely, we could see on the Galapagos. I think the logger finch could come into play, the Chardonnay finch, takeaway finch, pizza finch, all again with very specialized adaptations. Really intriguing. And there are, of course, a whole host of other species. Again, Vanessa introduced us to the giant tortoises, marine iguanas, the Galapagos penguin, which is the northernmost penguin. All other penguins occur further south of the Galapagos, the famous flightless cormorant. So the general pattern, again, is that the species on the Galapagos seem to be related to and likely derived from ancestors found in South America, but they're yet distinct and different from them. They've adapted these specialized features and lifestyles and ways of making a living that set them apart. So here are some quotes from Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. This is actually the second edition that appeared in 1845. We can't write as scientists like this any longer. Pam and I and other colleagues in the sciences would not be able to get away with writing something in a scientific paper with this sort of flowery language, but this was the way science, in many cases, was documented and written well over 100 years ago. Hence, or actually, I'm sorry, 200 years ago, almost 200 years ago. Hence, both in space and time, they seem to be brought somewhat near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth. Seeing this gradation and diversity of structures in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species has been taken and modified for different ends. That's not quite a statement of the theory of evolution, but it's clearly heading in that direction. And again, emphasizing really the importance of the observations that Darwin made on the Galapagos and stimulating his thinking and leading to formulating his theory. So Darwin returned to England, published his account of the beagle in 1839. It was actually a bestseller. It's still a good read, although the style of language is a little archaic in 2020. It's still a pretty good story, and he is very candid in his opinions and observations of the different places he visited. It has, of course, a much longer title than Voyage of the Beagle in the style of writings of that day. Journal of Researches into the Geology and Natural History of the Various Countries Visited by HMS Beagle under the command of Captain Fitzroy, Royal Navy, from 1831 to 1836. Again, we don't write titles like that any longer as well. And you have to be a little cautious in giving Darwin the credit for this theory really just occurring to him full blown while he was still in the Galapagos. He actually inserted new passages in the Voyage of the Beagle in the 1840s to kind of reflect the change or the development of his thinking and the way his thinking had grown in the years since. So again, he returns from the voyage, and he mainly lived for the rest of his life, and he died in his 70s in 1882 at a country house called Down House, south of London. He was often ill, and there are some mysteries about his illness, whether he encountered something on the voyage that caused him to be chronically ill, or whether he might have been sort of a hypochondriac. But in any case, after he returned, he never left England again. This epic voyage, this 5-year voyage, hugely dangerous and exciting, and then never left England after he came back. And his most famous work, Origin of Species, was published in 1859. So here's Down House, his house south of London, his study. Those of you, when we can resume that kind of travel, who are interested in this sort of history, if you're ever in the UK, this is a great day trip outside of London to visit Down House. It's still maintained in the way it was set up when Darwin was living there. And again, you see Darwin as the young man in middle age, and then this iconic vision or the iconic sort of view of Darwin as the elderly sage late in his life. And this is the frontispiece from his most famous work on the origin of species. I mentioned an MSU connection. There is one. So the archives at the MSU library include the original of a letter that Darwin wrote in 1878 to William Beal. And those of you who know the MSU campus will know Beal Gardens, among other things that are named for Beal. He was a very prominent plant biologist in the earlier history of when we were Michigan Agricultural College, experimented on improving crop yields and things like that. So this is obviously long, long before anything like email or being able to even call somebody on the phone and talk to them. Darwin was a great letter writer. He wrote a huge correspondence with colleagues in different parts of the world. And he wrote this short letter to Beal in 1878. Dear Sir, I am much obliged for your extremely kind notice of my book on cross-fertilization, and for your note of May 2nd. I have further to thank you for a copy of your article on hares, brackets, grasses, etc. I am glad that you intend to experiment. I remain, dear sir, yours faithfully, Charles Darwin. So he would dash off notes like that, probably many in the course of a busy day, to colleagues and people he was corresponding with around the world just to keep in touch. So one nice little story that I'll end on involving a Galapagos tortoise. This is Harriet the tortoise. Originally, Harriet was named Harry until it was realized some years later that Harry is Harriet. Harriet was a female tortoise. So Harriet was collected by Darwin in 1835 as a very young tortoise while he was visiting the Galapagos. Harriet got carried back to England on the Beagle, eventually came into the hands of one of the officers on the Beagle, Charles Wickham, who brought Harriet from England to Australia in 1841. I don't have the complete history, but Harriet lived either as sort of a pet or in a series of different zoos in Australia, finally ending up at Australia Zoo near Brisbane, up in Queensland. And Harriet passed away in 2006 at the ripe old age of about 176 years old. So they are indeed long-lived animals. And I think I'll stop there. And thank you again for zooming in with us tonight. And we look forward to the exciting potential of being with you on a trip next year in the summer. So thanks again, and I'll stop there and turn back over to Regina.
Thank you, Michael, very much. Okay. All right. So next we have Pamela. And by the way, for those that you do not know, Michael and Pamela are married. It was great to be able to get the two of them to agree to serve as faculty hosts on this trip. So Pamela Rasmussen is an ornithologist specializing in the study of Asian birds and is the lead author of Birds of South Asia, the Ripley Guide. She has authored and co-authored the scientific discoveries of 11 new species of bird and serves on the American Ornithological Society's Northern American Checklist Committee. Sorry, that's a little. She leads educational abroad programs mainly to Malaysia, Indonesia, and Costa Rica, and travels globally to photograph and sound record birds. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. All right, so a little bit of well, I have to be straightforward and say that I haven't been to the Galapagos yet. So I have a lot to learn about the birds of the Galapagos, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I have traveled a lot and photographed a lot of birds. I'm not a great photographer, but I do a lot of it. And the Galapagos is one of those iconic places where you can hardly take a bad photo from what I gather. So I'm looking forward to it. But I did manage to find some of my own photos of birds that occur in the Galapagos and elsewhere. So I'm going to torture you with those. They're not necessarily very good, but these are not my photos because these are all birds that I have not photographed. Well, actually, I have a photo of this one, which you'll see. It's bad, but anyway. So we're just going to take an overview of the birds of the Galapagos. And birds of the Galapagos are really famous. And why is that? There are not nearly as many species of birds in the Galapagos as there are in Ecuador, just across the water. I mean, in continental Ecuador, there are so many more species in the mainland. But still, people go to Galapagos for the birds, and the reasons are manifold. For one thing, there are a lot of endemic species, endemic meaning that they only occur, species that only occur in the Galapagos. And many of those only occur on one or a few of the islands of the Galapagos. And the Galapagos avifauna, or the birds that occur there, are extremely different from that of the mainland. There are no hummingbirds, there are no kingfishers, there are no, there's a whole group of birds that's like, there's probably several hundred species of subausines in Ecuador in the mainland, and there's only 2 in the Galapagos. So what there are though is radiations of birds that don't occur on the mainland or anywhere else. And there are a lot of what we call near endemic seabirds, meaning birds that breed on the Galapagos, and then they may wander away when they're not breeding and may end up in the coast of Central America or Ecuador. Several species of the Galapagos are endangered, like the waved albatross, shown here. And this is one of the single species mockingbird, single island endemics, one of the mockingbirds of Floriana, I believe. And one of the most amazing things about the birds of the Galapagos is their tameness. So they're famous for this. The mockingbirds, whatever island you're on, they're mockingbirds, and they just hop around the beach, minding their own business, not too worried about what people are doing unless they think it can help them in some way. And that, like, the world's tamest flycatcher is on the Galapagos. So the birds evolved in the absence of humans and did not ever develop fear of humans. All right, so there'll be a little bit of overlap with what others have said, but that's okay. So I thought I'd start with just looking at the flightless birds of the Galapagos. Oops. There are two species of flightless birds in the Galapagos, and they're both found only in the Galapagos. The Galapagos penguin, I wish this was my photo, it's not. And I've put range maps from eBird, and unfortunately they're partly obscured here, but that's okay. Anyway, so what this shows is that people see this bird in lots of different places in the Galapagos. So I understand that we have a good chance to see it on this itinerary. This is quite an uncommon bird with low numbers, but if you go to the right place, you can see it. It's the only penguin that lives on the equator. So the equator runs basically right through here, and the penguin lives on either side of it. There's also the flightless cormorant, which is a large cormorant that long ago lost the ability to fly. It's not adaptive for it to maintain the expensive equipment for flight, and it's adaptive for it to be heavy-bodied and be able to dive better than if it were still compromising between flying ability and diving ability, as other cormorants do. They are also relatively relatively localized in the Galapagos, but there are places where if you go, you can see them. And there was, I will tell you, there was a probably flightless member of the family up in the Aleutians, but it was clubbed to death basically by the early explorers. And so the only one that still survives is the flightless cormorant. It almost seems relatively miraculous that this defenseless bird didn't suffer the same fate. All right, we already heard about the boobies, and so I won't make the obvious apology for the name, which is it's actually a corruption of the name Bobo, which meant stupid in Spanish. At least that's what I've been informed, because they used to be so, well, actually it might have been in the Galapagos where they were so tame that people could just club them. Anyway, so Galapagos is rightly famous for its boobies, but none of them are actually endemic species, but it's a great place to see them and to experience them. The Nazca booby is this one that looks like a masked booby, which is a much more widely distributed species, but it's got an orange bill and a few other differences, and turns out that it's a different species, and that wasn't realized until the 1990s. And you can see it's got a wide range. I'm sorry, this is blocked off, but this is Central America. These are the Galapagos. It mainly breeds in the Galapagos. But once in a while, it gets off to California where it creates a sensation. This one was actually photographed in California. It's a cliff nester, while the blue-footed booby, which is aptly named, also has a much wider range. It nests in some of the islands near Baja, etc., and nests in a variety of places, but it's best seen in Galapagos because you can walk right by them and observe them in every detail, and they don't care. So they're very famous for their mating dance, and I don't know if it's the seasonality will mean that we can see that or not, but they're a ground nester. So this whole area is just littered with nesting blue-footed boobies, and we have to, if we're there, we'll just be very, very close to them. And again, I want to say I don't know the exact distributions of these birds in relation to the itinerary that's planned. So I may mention a bird species that we wouldn't be seeing, but we'll see a lot of birds, I'm sure of that. So we'll see most of these, I'm sure of that as well. And this is the red-footed booby. It's actually widely distributed. So all around the you can say the pan-tropical oceans. And it's a tree nester. And this is my miserable photo from Costa Rica last year, back before COVID. And it's the most, despite being the smallest of all the boobies, it's the one that is most pelagic, meaning that it ventures the farthest out to sea to catch its food. And it's also the most widespread one of those that occur in the Galapagos. There are 2 species of frigate bird in the Galapagos. And frigate birds are one of the most amazing groups of birds on the planet because their feathers weigh more than their skeleton. They have the highest wing loading of, there's another term that I'm not coming up with. Anyway, they have the greatest wing surface area, feather surface area of any bird on the planet. And they are seabirds that never enter the water. They catch their food by grabbing it from the surface. They don't swim, they don't dive. But they are easy to see in the Galapagos. There's the 2 species, the magnificent frigate bird, and the males puff out their gular sacs, gular pouches in the breeding season to attract females. Otherwise, these are shrunken in. And the other one, and I should say that the one on the Galapagos has generally been considered to be the same as the one that we have in like the Caribbean and off Mexico, but it's recently been found to be genetically very, very distinct. And in fact, I wrote a proposal to the South American Checklist Committee this summer, proposing that they should be considered possibly as an endemic breeding species to the Galapagos. They do disperse to Central America in the non-breeding season. But I don't think that it will be considered a separate species, but it needs to be considered as a possibility because they are so genetically distinct. And the great frigate bird looks virtually identical in the males, unless you see the scapulars. So the scapulars, these feathers, these long falcate feathers of the male great frigate bird are green and they're purple in the magnificent. So they're really hard to tell apart. But the females are relatively easy. I took this photo in Indonesia, but it's got a gray throat in the female, and the female of the magnificent, this one I took in Costa Rica, these are not good, I know, but has a black throat. So frigate birds can be a challenge, but they are often identifiable. This one is mainly found in the Old World tropics, but also the Galapagos. All right, so some miscellaneous groups. There's one species of pelican, the brown pelican, which this photo I took in Costa Rica. And there's just the one. It is an endemic subspecies in the Galapagos. It isn't exactly the same as the one I took the photo of, but it's widely distributed. And one did turn up in Michigan a few months ago, but almost nobody saw it. So, the flamingo, I took this photo in the Yucatan, but they occur mainly in the Caribbean and also in the Galapagos. And again, it's an endemic subspecies in the Galapagos. And the red-billed tropic bird, I took this photo here in Oman, but they're also found mainly off New World coasts. All right, then we have the group that we call tube noses or Procellariiformes. And the most amazing one, I think in most people's opinion, the most beautiful one, the most charismatic one is the waved albatross. So albatrosses are always fantastic. The waved albatross is really unusual with it's called waved because each of these feathers has little markings on it, kind of wavy, dark markings. And they're very, very beautiful birds, but with the advent of longline fishing, they, like other albatrosses, have become imperiled because they take the bait on the hooks and sink. But there's still quite a few. They don't reproduce quickly enough to recoup their losses, basically. And they're a breeding endemic. So what I mean by that is that they breed only in the Galapagos, but then they wander the rest of the year around. And so you might be lucky enough to see them off mainland Ecuador or Peru. The Galapagos shearwater is a recently split species, meaning it used to be considered the same species as the one that occurs in Hawaii, but now it's recognized that it's a different species. The same is true of the Galapagos petrel. These are both Galapagos breeding endemics, but they wander the rest of the year. For example, you can see the shearwater off the coast of Oaxaca, Mexico, up here. Up here in the non-breeding season. And the petrel also was considered conspecific, or the same species as the one in Hawaii until recently. And there are several species of storm petrels. This one is the Elliott storm petrel with its white belly. And then there are these that are more challenging to identify. So some of the storm petrels that we see, these are all, I should say, except for the albatross, these are all birds that one sees out to sea, not from the main islands, as far as I know. And I did see in one of the early photos in this presentation a bunch of both storm petrels and Galapagos shearwaters. So I believe we'll have opportunities to see them, but some of them will be unidentifiable. When you just get a really quick look at these storm petrels, they all look alike. So we'll just have to identify the ones that we can. Hopefully that'll be most. And there are very few raptors, but there is the Galapagos hawk, which can be quite common in some places. It's a relative of the Swainson's hawk, but it has become specialized to be a cooperatively breeding species. So each female, if she can, will have up to several mates. So the males will be faithful to her more or less, but she takes as many mates as she can get, and they all help to rear the young. And the barn owl, and this is a photo from England, so it's not the right form, but the one on the Galapagos is actually a very distinctive subspecies. And this is a terrible photo, I know, but I used it for a reason, and that is that the short-eared owl is found all over the world. And this one I photographed in the semi-dark just down the road in East Lansing, so on South Campus. So it's the same bird, different subspecies. All right, then we have rails, and rails are typically the hardest birds to see, but this one is a prize if you can see it. The Galapagos rail, it's not very often seen. You can see it's not dark purple like in the other maps, but maybe we'll have a chance. And then there's the paint-billed crake, probably pretty unlikely to see, but very beautiful if you do, but it's widely distributed, so you don't have to be in the Galapagos to see it. It's just really hard wherever you are. I don't know how this person got this fantastic photo. And then the common gallinule. So you may have already seen this bird. In fact, I took this photo of birds that we observed all summer long at Interurban Pathway down on Okemos Road. And shorebirds. So we aren't going there for the shorebirds, but we may see quite a few of them. In fact, these are all shorebirds that are relatively common all year long in the Galapagos. Most of the shorebirds are found there only in our winter, but because they migrate there. But some of the individuals will stay around all year. But I didn't take these there. I took these photos. This one was in Michigan. This one was in Alaska, actually off the coast of Sumatra. And I forget where that one was. Anyway, but we'll probably see quite a few shorebirds too, just not in big numbers like some of the other species. And I'm just kind of showing you that some of the species that we're already familiar with are there, like the sanderling and the turnstone and the whimbrel, etc. And then the gulls and terns of the Galapagos. Well, the gulls are both endemic. The swallow-tailed gull is one of the most beautiful gulls on the planet, and it is a breeding endemic. And if you could see the map, it breeds here and then wanders around to the coast, but it's much easier to see in the Galapagos than anywhere else. It's just fabulously beautiful bird, and it's partly nocturnal. It's got big eyes relative to the size of its head. The lava gull is also, it's a total endemic, it does not leave the Galapagos. And Galapagos are under here. And it's relatively rare. It's not hard to see, I don't think, if you're in the right place, but it has a relatively small population. The brown noddy is found all over the tropics, and the royal tern as well. And this one is my photo from Costa Rica. And these are all my photos, and that's because Galapagos has a bunch of herons and egrets. The one in the upper corner here is a cattle egret, and you don't really need to see that. But anyway, I took these photos, some of them right down the road and some of them elsewhere, but these are all the same species that we have here that are also, or here in the US, I should say, that are also in the Galapagos, with the exception of this, the striated heron, which in the Galapagos, they have this form and a dark one called the lava heron that's now considered the same species. And another highlight of the Galapagos is their mockingbirds, which it's been shown are most closely related to a South American species, probably the Chilean mockingbird. But in Galapagos, they underwent an adaptive radiation that led to speciation of at least 4 species. And this one, the Galapagos mockingbird, is found in most of the islands. But then there are some small islands. Let's see if I can move this. Okay, so the Galapagos mockingbird is found on most of the islands. So I don't believe that we'll be seeing this one, the Floriana, because I don't think that's on the itinerary. But you can only see this from the boat because they don't dock it, even if it was going there. And Espanola is also found only on the southern island. So these two aren't on the itinerary, but San Cristobal, let's see. Maybe, is that on the itinerary? Okay, well, anyway, so definitely we'll see this one, and they're all much of a muchness, but they have apparently a tremendous amount of personality, and you kind of got to watch out that you don't leave things around that they might grab, I guess. And then we have a bunch of miscellaneous land birds like the Galapagos dove, which is kind of pretty, dark-billed cuckoo. It's a widely distributed bird, but not an easy one to see anywhere. The Galapagos martin, a highly endangered bird only found in the Galapagos. And the vermilion flycatcher, this is not the right form. I took this one in maybe Arizona. The Galapagos flycatcher, which might land on you if you're in the right place. And the yellow warbler, which we have right around here. But I took this one in the Dominican Republic. And then the Galapagos finches. And I am not gonna say much about these. I think I used the same photo that Dr. Gottfried did inadvertently, but there are a lot of different species, 17 according to some authorities. And every last one of them is completely endemic to the Galapagos. So you don't see them anywhere else. And they're all sort of similar in plumage, either black or brown, but their bills are remarkably different from the large-billed ground finch to the warbler finch, etc., and everything in between. And sometimes they're pretty hard to identify. They're all very, very closely related, and they have been the subject of a great deal of study, and whole books have been written about the Galapagos finches. But they have adapted, like Dr. Gottfried said, to do things that no other bird does, like what the woodpecker finch does. This one, though, is called the vampire finch. It's the sharp-beaked ground finch, and it has become sort of a vampire because it actually has learned to bite at and peck at the bases of growing feathers of incubating seabirds and cause the blood to flow, and then they can drink the blood. So the seabirds don't have any defense against this because it's a recent habit that these birds have learned to do, and the seabirds didn't evolve any defense for it. So I don't believe it's particularly dangerous to them, but it is relatively gruesome. And it is the only bird on the world that is, quote unquote, a vampire. And with that, I'll end. And if you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you, Pamela, very much. It was very interesting. Okay, so now what I want to do is kind of open it up to all of you. If you'd like to if you have any questions that you want to ask either Michael or Pamela or Vanessa. All you have to do is you'd have to unmute in order to, or you can also use the chat function and if you have a question, and then I can read it off.
This is Tim. I sent 3 questions by chat to Vanessa. Sorry about that. But they were, do we need to take antimalarials for this trip?
You do not. No.
Are there any other required inoculations?
No, sir, none. Nothing required, although we would say that you should check with your doctor just double check anything that he might personally recommend, but no, we don't recommend anything.
Okay, but anti-malarials are not required.
No.
Okay, and the last one is there a November or December itinerary to the Galapagos, as that's the best time to visit Machu Picchu?
We don't offer a November or December itinerary. We have late October as our latest departures.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Tim, I might want to mention, or I'll go ahead and mention, you probably don't need any vaccinations, but one of the medications that I might recommend if you're sensitive to height, elevation, is the word I wanted to use. If you're sensitive to that, I would recommend talking with your doctor about getting medication. Guayaquil is elevation is quite high, and I know that I experienced that when I was there, that it does get you a little bit, but it all depends. If you're used to being in high elevations, then you might be okay. Okay, anyone else have any questions? One of the things I did want to ask Pamela is to view birds, do you have any recommendations of what people should bring, or types of cameras that are good to take pictures of some of the birds and wildlife?
Well, so the Galapagos is amazing in that you can see a lot of birds without binoculars, but of course, binoculars are strongly recommended, and I can't imagine going anywhere without them. So I would recommend a good pair, as good a pair of binoculars as you can get. And I can send a list or a link to some suggestions, but the really good ones cost, $1,000 or so, but a good pair, a decent pair, 300, or, from there on down, they're not as good, but for students, like we're always, for study abroads, students are always on a huge budget, and we try to recommend cheap pairs, but you get what you pay for, let's put it that way. And they're definitely worth it, but you definitely would want waterproof, and you'd want fog proof, and you'd want probably 8 powers with a good field of view. So there are certain brands that are just really reliable. And a camera, I would not go anywhere without my Nikon P900. I know it's a kind of a cop-out camera because it is small and lightweight, and you may not get the very best photos. And I know I showed you some of my terrible ones, but I get a lot of good photos too. And it's so convenient. But there's also the P1000, which I haven't gotten yet, but that's at like, I don't know, $1,200 to $1,500. I hear rave reviews about it. Of course, there's, the long lenses would be great, but they're heavier, and it's just so easy to use these super zooms. And in the bright light and open conditions of the Galapagos, it would be perfectly fine and get amazing photos. So, it's up to you whatever you want to do. Maybe you don't even want a camera, but I just can't imagine not taking the opportunity to get great photos, and it is super easy in the Galapagos to get them.
Wonderful. Thank you. I can say one of the things that the hiking, if you really love to hike, hiking on these islands there's quite a few rocks and boulders that you have to traverse, and the ship does supply walking sticks. So if you feel like you want to have something like that, they do supply those. So it is a nice thing to have if you feel like you might be a little bit unsteady on that kind of terrain. So do we have any other questions or comments? For those of you that haven't signed up for the tour, if you're interested, I can send you a preliminary flyer, and I can also send you the link to the webpage, or Bridge, our co-branded webpage, in which it has information regarding the tour too. So,
Real quick, I'll just mention one thing,
okay.
because I always like to read about places that I'm going. Reading Voyage of the Beagle might seem a little daunting, and it is a little bit heavy slogging until you get used to it. There's a really nice book, if you can see this, called Fossils, Finches, and Fuegians by an author named Richard Keynes. And it's an account of the Beagle voyage, and it also has the advantage of being written in recent years, so it puts things into, you know, a more modern sort of context with the importance of Darwin's observations on the voyage. And it reads like a nice sort of travel narrative style of writing, really, more than a heavier scientific style of writing. There are many tremendous numbers of books on Darwin, by Darwin, and also about Darwin. But this is for anyone interested in a little background reading on Darwin. It has an extensive section on the Galapagos part of the voyage in it. So that's one that I would think would be an interesting one for folks if they're into reading about it in advance.
Well, I will consider that as one of our gifts to people that have chosen to go on the tour. We can send that out ahead of time, and so that people can have an opportunity to read it prior to. So
for a small price, you can have my slightly worn and tattered and slightly beaten around the edges copy. For a very small price.
We can raffle it off. How's that?
There you go. There you go.
But to be returned, though. Okay. Do we have any other questions before we end this? I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for taking part. And hopefully before the tour, a month or so before the tour, we can maybe set something up again like this, that we can have Vanessa come on and kind of go through the itinerary again, and who our guides will be and so forth. So, okay.
Thanks, everybody. Everybody stay well and
Thank
be
you.
healthy out there. And take care. Bye. Bye. Good night, everyone.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.